Oil paint. Is it worth it? How does it compare? Where do I start? Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Ren, aka Moss Ren, and I am a transmask illustrator turned painter and your favorite fantasy surrealist. Happy New Year and welcome to 2025. Last year I decided that I wanted to take the leap and start my oil painting journey after approximately 10 years of digital illustration. I've been posting my progress over on Instagram and have gotten a lot of questions about how I feel about oil paint and what my experience has been so far. So I thought I would make a video about it and share it here on YouTube. I have been painting and drawing for approximately my whole life. I think I've pretty much tried like every single type of paint medium by now. I've tried watercolor, acrylic, gouache, and acrylic gouache. I'm not sure if there are other paint mediums that I just have no idea about. If there are, let me know. I would love to try them out. But I think those are like the main ones that everyone knows about, and I have tried them all. I only started oil painting last October, so it's been about 4 months now. So I am in no way an expert. I'm not even an expert in any of the other mediums that I've tried. So this is all just going to be my personal opinion and experience with paints. So the first question I got was any tips on where/how to start. This is a really common question I find when it comes to oil paint. I had the exact same kind of dilemma when I was researching how to start oil painting. I feel like it has quite a scary reputation since you kind of Google it and there's all these terms like, you know, fat over lean, solutions, mediums, solvents, all this kind of stuff. So I'm gonna try to break it down in a way that I've understood it and hopefully in a way that makes it a little bit easier for you to wrap your head around what it is that you actually need to start. So to begin, oil paint, as it's in the name, is an oil-based paint compared to acrylic, watercolor, gouache. Acrylic, gouache are all water-based paints. I'm not sure if this is common knowledge. It should be, I hope, but oil and water do not mix, so you cannot use water in the same way that you do with acrylic paint. And so that's where stuff like solvents and mediums come into play. So the first thing to keep in mind is that you cannot use water to thin your paints, clean your brushes, or mix paint with. There is also a saying or a rule out there called the fat over lean rule. It's basically a layering rule to make sure that your paint dries evenly on the canvas and prevents cracking. Cracking occurs when the paint on the very top layer dries before the paint underneath has fully dried. And so as the paint underneath is drying, it kind of moves and adjusts and hardens, and then the layer on top that's fully dry ends up kind of moving and splitting to accommodate all the movement that's happening underneath. And that's why stuff cracks. So, what does fat and what does lean even mean? Fat just means more oil, lean means less oil. Imagine that there's a linear scale. We've got lean on one side, fat on the other side, and paint straight out the tube in the middle, which I'll call neutral. You can thin your paint with a solvent to make it more lean, which means it becomes more translucent and it dries faster, or you can add a medium such as linseed oil to make the paint fattier, which you layer on top of the thin and the neutral paint. I have stolen this idea of a linear scale from the YouTuber slash oil painter Thomas Minnick. He explained it in a really kind of simple and concise way that made me kind of understand how it all works, so I definitely recommend going to check out his channel. Yeah, he has a lot of very informative educational content over there, so I definitely recommend checking him out. So, how do I add more oil versus adding less oil? So this is where a solvent and a medium comes in. A solvent is like an alcohol solution, such as like turpentine, I think is common, like traditional paint thinner. So that's kind of what a solvent is. And a medium is just some kind of oil. So I use linseed oil, which I have here. Adding oil to the paint makes it so the paint dries slower. Adding solvent or alcohol to the paint makes the paint thinner and dry quicker. So to clarify, I personally don't use any solvents in my painting. I don't have a very well ventilated area to paint in, and I've also got a cat at home, so I would prefer to not have, you know, the chemicals and solvents kind of evaporating in my lounge air. I know that you can get odorless solvent, but I personally believe that just because you can't smell it doesn't mean that it's not there. So I feel like that's a personal preference. Obviously there's a lot of people who have well ventilated spaces that use solvents all the time, people that choose to use solvents regardless of their space. It's just a personal choice, but I've made it to not use any solvents. What that means is that I'm basically only using 1/2 of that linear fat lean, oh my god, what am I saying? Fat over lean scale. I'm using paint straight out of the tube, which is going to be my first layer, and then I'm just adding oil to layer on top, so I'm not bothering with this side of the scale. So now that I've badly explained how oil paint kind of works, we can get on to our second question, which is tips on where to start. Personally, I would start with the 3 primary colors, so red, yellow, and blue, just to save money. I mean, when I started, because I already know like the kind of color palette I use in my own paintings, I did go ahead and buy the, what did I buy? I bought like a fresh pink because I use a lot of magenta and cyan colors, so I bought like a few extra colors on top of my primaries. But if you're just starting out and you don't know necessarily what you want to paint, you can make every color with the primary colors. So I would just start with those 3, save yourself some money and hassle if you end up not liking oil paint. Next, I would make sure that you have some Hog Bristle Brushes. You definitely want something coarse. I've noticed that you can't really use the same types of paintbrushes as you do with watercolor and acrylic, like really smooth and kind of flowy paintbrushes, because the oil paint just doesn't really stick and it makes it quite difficult to lay the paint on the canvas. So definitely try to get something coarse. I personally went for Hog Bristle. I don't really have a reason for it. I just didn't really want synthetic, but obviously Hog Bristle isn't really that great either, but you know, whatever, that's the reason why I got Hog Bristle. You can decide whether you want to get natural or synthetic brushes as well. When you are just starting out, I would also probably not even bother with solvents and mediums. I would just use the paint straight out of the tube and see, you know, get a feel of how it works. It's not as if you can't layer it. You can wait for the paint to dry before painting over it. So I don't think that solvents and mediums are necessarily necessary. When it comes to cleaning your brushes, unlike acrylic and water-based paints, most people kind of have a jar of water that they like wash their brushes in between like picking colors. With oil, if you're not using a solvent, a jar of water is not going to cut it. Nothing will happen. So what I do, because I'm not using solvents, is I just have an old tea towel and I just wipe off any excess paint from my paintbrush before picking up the new paintbrush. before picking up the new paint. This was something that I was a little bit concerned about when I first started. I, didn't really trust that the towel would be able to clean the brush fully, but surprisingly, it doesn't really mix. Like, even if there's a little bit of paint left on the brush, when you pick up the new paint, it's not like thin enough to mix on the paintbrush. So I've not really noticed this being a huge issue when I want clean colors. Sometimes, it's not like 100%, which is probably why a lot of artists do use solvents to clean their brushes, but for the type of art that I make, that is, kind of messy, because I'm not really worried about that kind of stuff. This has been working fine. What I would do as well, if you're choosing not to use solvents, is to research something called alla prima. Alla prima just means wet on wet, which means instead of waiting for each layer to dry fully before painting over it, you're adding oil to make the paint fattier, which means that it sits on top of the already wet paint without mixing the layers. I don't know if I explained that very well. And on the topic of drying times, a big question I've been getting is, how do I find and deal with the long drying times of oil? I'm not sure if many people know this, but oil paint takes approximately 6 to 12 months to fully dry or cure. A misconception that I had when I first started oil painting was that the canvas would still be wet to touch after 6 to 12 months, which is just not true. I feel like that misconception comes about because people use the term dry to describe the curing process. Now, I don't know the science behind it, but curing is when all the molecules in the paint reacts with oxygen and hardens and turns into plastic, basically. The difference between curing and being touch dry is that when a canvas is touch dry, like my canvas here, the very top layer is dry to the touch, so I can touch it, there's no paint on my fingers, I can paint over it, it's not going to lift up any of the paint that's dry on the canvas, but it is not fully cured because there are still paint molecules underneath that can be damaged or moved about, or that are basically just not dry. So that's where that kind of comes in. The first thing is that unlike acrylic, which dries pretty much as soon as you lay it on the canvas, oil paint takes about 2 to 3 days to become touch dry. Sometimes it can take up to a week if it's like a particularly thick slab of paint that I've put on there. I find that that kind of extra 2 to 3 days means that oil paint kind of gives you a larger window to work with, and that makes stuff like blending really easy. It makes adjusting things super easy. You can wipe things away once you've already put it on the paint. You don't have to paint over something like you do with acrylic. And the biggest thing that I've noticed is that I feel like I'm not wasting so much paint, because not only does oil paint take longer to dry on the canvas, but it also takes longer to dry on your paint palette. I cannot tell you how much paint I feel like I wasted back in the day when I was using acrylics. You would be painting a huge canvas, you would put your dollop of paint on the palette, and then halfway through, half an hour later, that whole pile of paint that you've put on your palette is dry and you can't use it, or you've mixed the perfect shade that you want to put on your canvas, and half an hour later it is dry and you need to remix it. That is just not an issue with oil paint. I can have a palette sitting out all day and the paint is still usable. I actually keep my paint in a plastic Tupperware container and I put it in the freezer after each painting day, and this has been in my freezer for about a week, and all the paints in there are still still wet and can still be used on the canvas, which just, I personally think is great. I feel like I'm not wasting so much paint. I like that I can kind of take my time. I feel like a big thing for me was with painting was that I felt like I had to do it all in one go. And I feel like acrylics really didn't help with that because, you know, they just dried out so quickly, and I felt like if I wanted to blend something, I had to get it done really quickly on the canvas, and if I made a mistake, it would be really annoying because I would look at it later and I'd be like, okay, I have to paint over it, which is just, you know, annoying. And so I feel like oil paint just really helped me slow down and work on things slowly and know that, like, if I am not feeling it, or if I do something one day that I'm not too sure about, I know that I can just leave it until the next day and give myself time to think about it and look back on it and still be able to pick up exactly where I left off the day before. So that has been a huge boon with oil paint compared to acrylics. I will say that acrylics is kind of the only paint that dries that quickly. Like, obviously when you've got like a watercolor palette or a gouache palette, you can keep those like air sealed and the paint will still be wet or usable after a certain amount of time. The reason why I'm less drawn to watercolor and gouache compared to something like acrylic or oil in this case is that if you've seen any of my digital illustrations, you will know that I really enjoy opaque and bright colors. I feel like it's really difficult to get really opaque layers with watercolor. Gouache has more pigment, which is, you know, what I wanted, and that's the reason why I explored it in the first place. But gouache reactivates when you try to layer, which was a struggle, which is why I moved to acrylic gouache, which genuinely I do really like acrylic gouache. I like that the paint is super opaque, I like that it's really smooth, I like that you can layer on it without lifting up the paint underneath. That's all like just really good. I find that the reason why I'm more drawn to oil paint compared to acrylic gouache is simply just a texture thing. When I wanted to jump back into traditional painting, having really like thick brush strokes and being able to like see the paint on the canvas was something that I was really drawn to and wanted to explore, and that's not really something that you can do with acrylic gouache. Acrylic gouache is very smooth, it's very matte, which is really good for like more illustrative styles, but I wanted to push myself in another direction and do, you know, very like impressionist and like kind of rough painting, which is why I prefer oil paint to acrylic gouache or watercolor or gouache. So the final question is oil paint worth it? I think yes. Overall, I feel like oil paint just ticked a lot of the boxes that I was personally looking for in a paint medium. It has the paint thickness and opaqueness of acrylic paint. It dries slower, which means that it has a larger window for workability because I work full time and I don't have all day to sit and paint and finish something. I feel like the slow drying times really work with my schedule. You can choose to either wait for layers to dry before painting on top, or you can paint alla prima, which means that you paint wet on wet, so all in one go. And I feel like the positives of all of those things kind of outweigh how confusing the whole solvent and mediums and fat over lean stuff is. So personally, I really enjoy oil paint. I feel like it's definitely worth it to try out. The paint itself is like so fun to use on the canvas. It's so like thick and buttery, and you can really blend things and get beautiful gradients as well as getting really thick kind of rough brush strokes. I just think the versatility of oil paint is just way better than any of the other mediums that I've tried personally. I'm personally really happy that I took the leap and started to take up oil painting. I do think that it kind of depends on what kind of art you personally want to make. If you see oil paintings out there and you're like, yeah, I really want to do that, like I definitely think that you shouldn't be scared to start oil painting. For me, and the way that the kind of art that I want to create, oil paint has just been such a great thing. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you want to see more videos of my oil painting process, I have 3 more on my channel that kind of go along me painting my first canvas back in October. I also kind of talk about why I decided to take up oil painting and move away from digital illustration, and how I got to the point where oil painting was kind of like my only option as an artist moving forward. If you want some, you know, thoughtsy videos, you can go check those out. Hopefully this video was informative enough for you. I have linked some further reading and videos down in the description. They're all things that I read or watched that I feel kind of helped me decide if oil painting was for me. If you have any further questions that I might have missed or things that you thought were confusing, let me know in the comments. I would be happy to answer any and all questions sent my way, unless I don't know the answers to them, in which case I would recommend you check out other more experienced oil painters in the YouTube space. I appreciate every single one of you for being here. I really hope that you enjoyed the video. Thank you for making all of this so much fun to share, and I will see you all next time.